going to conferences all the time is the main driver for progress in your skill set and also your relationship, and basically any professional can become a better professional by attending conferences.
It's not the standard, okay? It's a movie theater, but the visual is great and the sound is great, and I've seen a lot of room and space, and I think it's organized well.
Seeing all the people here today and they're excited about stuff, you can see the energy and the desire to learn and do new things.
And I was positively surprised about the depth, the technical depth of the sessions, and how that makes the tester part of the team.
I think developers do benefit from coming to QA conferences, just the same as testers can benefit from going to dev conferences. You've got to have a broad understanding of what's going on.
It's really inclusive. I would say it's super diverse. People are really open and friendly, and it's really organized.
Conferences are well worthwhile just for the ideas that they spark in people. When people come back to the office, they're full of ideas and they're all energized up.
Hi, I'm Johan Abildskov and I'm from Denmark. In my day-to-day work, I'm a DevOps transformation lead at Efficode, and I help customers figure out the cultural and technical capabilities that can help them get to better DevOps performance. In my talk today, I will talk about automation and how we look about it wrong and how that keeps putting unnecessary roadblocks in our way to better testing and deployment capabilities. Thank you and enjoy. Hello and welcome to my talk. I'm Johan Abildskov and I'm a DevOps transformation lead at Efficode. And my day-to-day work is all about helping teams and organizations transform into a more DevOpsy way of working. And of course, testing and test automation is a big part of that. So I'm so happy that you are here to listen to me say something about how automation is very hard, and we make it even harder for ourselves by the way we approach it. If you have any questions during the talk, please put them, I think, down there in the Slido, and then I will cover the questions at the end of the talk. I will put the slides online so you can get them. But DevOps we're going to talk about DevOps because that's the perspective I come from. And it's kind of grown from being about the gap between development and operations, and over time annexed more and more different parts of the organization, such as InfoSec or QA, Dev Biz Ops, Dev Test Op, DevSecOps, so on and so forth. But let's just say that DevOps is the best bet we as an industry has on how to approach modern software development and operation. One definition of DevOps is COLMS, coined by John Willis and Edmund Davids back in the day, and then just Humble added the lean part. DevOps is about creating a culture of continuous learning, of psychological safety, of continuous experimentation. It's about automating, and that's one of the parts that we will dive into today. It's about lean product management and self-empowered teams, taking control of the entire value stream of their end-to-end flow. It's about measurement and being data informed, looking at how is the best bet at our reality rather than being driven by ideas and gut feelings. And it's also about sharing. So not necessarily sharing in the global public, but saying whatever we learn on our team, we want to improve our entire organization and escalating that towards the entire organization such that anyone can benefit. Transparency. So when we look at this common definition of DevOps, and organizations say, well, we believe now that DevOps is the way to go. We did some agile transformations and now DevOps is the next thing. So how should we begin? Then the first thing is that culture, that seems too difficult to touch. That's very vague. Lean is boring. Measurement seems like something that I can be kept accountable for, and sharing is just not enterprisey enough. So that leaves us with automation as the first thing we approach. And when we have decided that automation is the first thing that we want to approach, the first logical step is to say, well, then we need an army of robots, right? We need to automate everything. So we need a robot to run our tests. We need a robot to do our builds. We need a robot to deploy our environments. We need a robot to, we need a robot to, we need a robot to, we need a robot to. So we focus a lot on the technology part of building automation. We just need some robots so we can stop doing boring manual stuff. And that's not necessarily a very clever way of approaching automation. And if we look at automation as the first step of our DevOps journey, and we want to achieve some sort of DevOps heaven, and automation is the very first step we take in our DevOps initiative, how we approach automation becomes tremendously important for the success of our organization, for the success of our transformation approach. Yet it tends to be something that we approach without much intentionality. It becomes arbitrary or random or ad hoc. So I'll go through some of the ways that we approach automation wrong. And the first part is our organizations as a whole are wrong about automation. And that has some difficult consequences, because then how do we as teams, as engineers, approach automation in a setting where automation is misunderstood? The first misconception is that automation is a luxury. That automation is something that we can do when we're done doing our feature work. That it's something that the engineers can do for whatever geeky fun they want to do, and not as the force multiplier that it is and should be. So that's just plain wrong. And I think that at least we in this virtual room, we can agree that automation is much more than a luxury. Automation is a permission to play. If you are not focusing on automating, I don't want to buy software from you. I don't think that we can conscientiously say and claim that we're professional software engineers, developers, testers, operators, security people if we do not focus on automating. And there are many different profiles. This slide is from the State of DevOps Report 2019, where they have measured DevOps performance, software delivery, and operations performance, and seen how does that, depending on how high your performance is, what is the parts that we're automating. And we can see from this slide that things like build and unit test automation is not something that's up for discussion anymore. Even the low performers, more than half of those are automating build and test. And we can see we have things like automated provisioning and environment being one thing that high performers do to a high degree. We can also see that we have Slack integration, chatbot integrations, but perhaps that's not where you should start. So at least with things like automating builds, automating tests, automating provisioning of environments, which is something that I run into often at customer sites. Being on-prem can make it more difficult to automate environments, but that just means we waste a lot of time. So we automate all these things, and there are some things that are simply permission to play. If you do not have automated unit tests, you are already failing a bit, or at least falling behind. And it's basically already here. This is a pull request on GitHub from the React components. I think it's a bit more than a year ago I found this snippet. And what happens in this image is that a robot Dependabot finds a vulnerability and creates a pull request with an update. Then another robot builds the branch, the pull request towards the master branch to see if it's compatible and tests runs. After those tests has run, a third robot notices that the build was successful and merges the change. And then a fourth robot shows up saying, excellent work, and reacts with a funny GIF. So it's already here, this high degree of automation, and this is in an open source project. If we look into the Agile Manifesto, what we have here is simply a motivated team of individuals, right? So imagine what we can do if we have a motivated team with a budget, like we should have in our organizations. So it's already here, and there's really no excuse for not automating. And I think it's very important that we convince our organizations that automation is not something that we sprinkle on afterwards. Automation is something that we need to have focus on at the feature delivery level. We build quality and automation in. And then a very common excuse is the customer doesn't want automation. And to that I can just say it doesn't matter if the customer doesn't want automation. That's completely besides the point. Why are we leaking our implementation details like that? The customer doesn't want to pay for anything other than features. But I think that we, as professional software knowledge workers, we need to educate our customers that the customer should want automation or never be given the choice, right? We are the experts. We know how we can deliver quality to our customers. So why do we tell them, ask them, do you want to pay for automated tests? Put them in the invoice in the button. No, don't do that. Do professional software development delivery work. A very smart guy, Jan Bosch, professor of computer science, he has some excellent points. One of his points is that digitalization will kill companies too. And he identified 4 areas where he sees in the top management that there are problems. One of the first problems is that the skills in senior leaderships in terms of software are very limited. And that means that we have either a huge challenge in communicating upwards. How can we as engineers learn to communicate business value? And I think that's where testers are actually a key communicator. At least based on my experience, when I interact with the QA community, whatever we call testing, I see people that are very skilled at communicating business impact, risk, and things like that. And that is also something that I got out of the keynote. That was very cool to see some concrete metrics and measurements and gains that we can communicate to our stakeholders in the higher business. Secondly, there's a lack of ambidexterity. So the business can't both invest in the future and deliver on today's challenges. So we tend to see that feature work is always prioritized over improvement work. And that gives short-term wins and long-term failures. So that is something that organizations need to be aware of. Senior management also believe that digitalization is a research and development problem, rather than understanding and embracing that digitalization is something that fathoms the entire organization and changes the way everything works. And that's not just in terms of digital products. That is just as much how digitalization can help us have high operational excellence, and how digitalization can facilitate whatever development or work we're doing. And lastly, they justify the lack of initiative by referring to the lack of desire for change from their most valuable customers. And again, if your customers are not driving you, who are? Is it the competition that will disrupt you? Or are you able to disrupt yourself or build ahead a way of working that will keep continuously improve your capabilities? that is going to be defining for whether or not you are able to stay a successful organization. Excellent. So I just want to reiterate, automation is not a luxury, and it must be a priority. The second misconception is that automation is complex. And I'm just going to flat out say that's wrong. If we have a shovel and we upgrade to automated digger and excavator, that's an obvious upgrade, assuming that our task is to remove some dirt from one place to another. But what we are actually trying to do, what we are trying to automate, is that we want to move a game of Jenga, and we want to deploy it all the way out this rickety bridge. And by the way, someone is, it's not just a game of Jenga, it's a game of Jenga that people are actually interacting with while we are trying to develop things. So this becomes very rickety. This is something that's very difficult to do in a sane, straightforward way. So because there are all these complex circumstances, our test automation or our automation initiatives becomes complex. And it all comes down to software architecture. We forget that software architecture is not based on blueprints and set in stone. We have the power and the capacity to change our software architecture, and we forget that, so we don't reap the benefits. Too often over time, our software architecture becomes something that hinders us rather than something that empowers us. So we need to make sure that we architect for testability. And this is one of the reasons that one of my favorite initiatives starting any DevOps transformation journey, whatever buzzword we're going to call it, is to look at test automation, because test automation stresses the entire software architecture in our organization. Are we able to react on the findings that we get? Are we able to deploy something that's testable? Are we able to have a single unit under test, or do we just test everything at once and hope that we're able to figure out what tiny piece of our complex software caused the entire test to fail? So we need to architect for testability, and we can change our testability. So I couldn't find a good quote for this, so I had to make one up. So this is me quoting me. Automating simple things is simple, and automating complex things might be impossible. And the asterisk is while retaining sanity. We can automate anything, but too often do we end up in something that's way too complex. And then we blame the automation effort for uncovering the complexity that was hidden in our outdated architecture. So that was some ways that our organizations are wrong about automation. And that's all good and well, but we, the engineers, are also wrong about automation. And I'll now go through a few of the ways that we are wrong about automation. So automation is also software, so we should treat it as such. And we forget that automation, that becomes something from a developer's perspective that is not a first-class citizen of our development ecosystem, and that's just pure wasteful and wrong and misinformed from our lovely developers. So this means that version control of our automation and versioning of our automation actually matters. Which version of our test automation with which version of our tests, with which version of our test data, with which version of our software actually end it out in this test artifact. So we actually need to version control things, also our automation. And we need to not necessarily test our test automation, but we need to take care of our test automation. Just because a small step gets added into a corner of automation, everything cannot simply just break, right? And we have this tendency that our automation becomes very fragile. And as again in the keynote mentioned, it can't be fragile tests or fragile environments that results in failed tests. Then they become worthless. And we have too often seen that, okay, build 1, 2, 3, 4, failed, I build again. Now it was a success, so we can release because we have one successful build. But what does that say about our confidence in that build? So we actually need to actively design our test automation. We need to architect our test automation. We need to be deliberate about how our test automation works, and not just do it naively and then let it run until it becomes so painful we need a big bang change. And we need to continuously maintain our testing. That also means that our tests needs to be architected for maintainability, right? So when we, at least from I come from primarily from a developer background. So when I say we, I perhaps mean the lazy developers. We can have a tendency to say a test is something that we write once and then we forget it exists until it fails. And we run tests in the same order every time, and it's just going through the hoops. But we need to be continuously maintaining our tests, both in terms of how they work from a non-quality perspective, but also maintain how they cover our requirements. Are all tests still relevant? Can we change the order of our tests? Do we have dependencies between our tests? And this is where I really hope that the testing community can enlighten and educate those who simply call themselves developers. So we forget to do these things, yet we automate all the things, right? Everything must be automated. I'd never want to do anything manually. So we automate all the things, and we forget whether it's something that shouldn't be automated. We forget that the automation becomes an artifact that we need to maintain. We forget the total cost of ownership of our tools. And this can both be a reason for buying more off-the-shelf software, using more open source software, have testing services, cloud-based SaaS solutions. Or it might still be a good reason to develop things in-house, but we need to make it a deliberate choice. And we often forget that. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the NIH syndrome, the not invented here syndrome. We tend to care more about the stuff that we build ourselves. It's also called the IKEA effect. And we as engineers are fantastically bad at killing our darlings. Right? I understand how this works. This fits my mental model completely because it came from my mind. But that might not be the best way to do things, and it might not be what makes my team most efficient. In particularly not if I change my job or get fired. So we need to focus on building something good for the team and having spend our innovation, energy, focus, creativity where we differentiate ourselves. And unless we are an organization that is focused on testing and automation, that is probably not where we should spend most of our energy, because that's not what differentiates us. That's what's necessary. That's what's so important to have a great foundation upon which we can do our business innovation. So our organizations think of automation wrong. We, the engineers, think about automation wrong. And we do automation initiatives wrong as well. And the first simple thing that we do wrong is that our strategy sucks. one might say it's too big of a word when we talk about strategy, because most plans I've seen looks like this. Our master plan is that we automate and then we profit, right? There are so many different things that we haven't considered here that we should do. How do we automate? What do we automate? Why do we automate? And I'm going to refer to the so-called J-curve of, again, from this is from the State of DevOps report. And what they found was that going from low to medium performance starts with deployment automation. So now we can deploy, our pipeline can deploy our software. So we remove some of the manual work in terms of what we, in terms of deployment. But that means that we have a lot more items flowing through our pipeline. So that can put us stress and create much more manual work around testing and change approval processes. So what this means is that our automation effort might even have created more manual work in absolute terms, even though we removed some type of manual work. So that just means that now we have a lot more manual work to do, and we have to maintain our complex automation. Our hopefully well-designed, simple, perfectly fit automation. But we now have both much manual work and automation to maintain. And then as we can automate more testing, automate more change approval processes, then we can move towards high performance, actually lowering the amount of manual work. So if we're not aware of this trap at the beginning of our transformation efforts, when we plan our strategy, then at some point we will end up in a place where we start automating things and it just begins hurting more. So then we automate and then we fail, and then we say, okay, we tried automation. It didn't work for us. It was just a bother. And then we have an organization that's really in a bad place. Another important point is that there is no silver bullet, right? We really want to just say, well, if we just automate everything away, then it will be much better. But again, we need to be deliberate about why do we automate, what do we automate, and what do we expect to gain from this automation, rather than just saying we want to replace any manual step with automation. In the site reliability engineering, they talk about toil, that is the manual work that doesn't require any engineering mindset. And toil should be minimized and automated away. But of course, it should be a trade-off. What is the return on investment for automating this? Peter Drucker, a management thinker, said, there's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. So when we automate, we might be treating symptoms. We might be saying, okay, this step is really stupid and it takes a lot of energy. It's error prone, it's repetitive, it's boring, all those things. The first question we should ask ourselves is not, can we automate it? The first question should be, can we stop doing this? So the most powerful automation strategy is, of course, to stop doing things. Because we need something actionable, I have provided you with the silver bullet. You can find it on my GitHub account. And you can run it in your pipelines where you have very wasteful steps. And we run the script and it eliminates the wasteful step. And if we check the content of our silver bullet, we can see that we simply say echo wasteful step. And then you're done for the week. You eliminated a wasteful step. Of course, this is not something that you should run in your production environments. But figure out if the silver bullet of automation in your organization is actually manipulating the process rather than trying to come up with technological workarounds for your process. So I only spent half an hour going through this, and we have 10 more minutes for me talking. So I will now find the question asking application and see if anything came in. So I have an excellent question here that I will read aloud, and then we will talk about that. You mentioned not listening to client about adding automation, but how to justify extra automation work / tools on small scope projects that are cost sensitive. So that is an excellent question. So of course, the small scope projects can't bear a big burden of automation. If we are a freelancer doing, let's say, small websites or something along the order of, I will spend 2 weeks of work time on solving a customer engagement. If the scope I'm hitting here is not the right one, please update, of course. But let's say that we have 2 weeks to solve a problem, to solve a customer request, then it is unlikely that it's valuable to spend a lot of time on automation in the scope of this project. My bet, my feeling, my argument is that if we work in a right way, so we try to continuously behind the scenes or between customer engagements or at some fraction of our time, try to build in our automation capabilities such that we, for instance, know that all the customer projects we do will have automated unit tests because that's easy. Then writing those unit tests, doing that automation effort will actually lower the cost of the project itself. So you will be able to work much more efficiently. And my experience is that if we do not go overboard, then we can get a lot of return on investment on small investments in automation. So the issue is that we put it as something that's beside the, like on an individual line item. And it's also something that we, at least again, I speak as developers, we tend to think about how we spend our time wrong. So we tend to say, I'm productive when I write code. I'm productive when I type. But I bet that if you measure how much you spend your day typing and how much you spend your day thinking or trying to understand what you just typed, trying to debug why things are not working, all those things, trying to figure out why you updated the customer's website, but now it's broken. I think that if we are looking much more at how we spend our time, we will see that we need to not optimize for how much code we write, but for reading our code, for debugging our code, and test-driven development, automated unit tests, automated deployments. All those things will actually make us productive. And my claim is that it will also do that in the long run. But of course, it's much more difficult to do within the scope of small projects, but then do small automations in the background, so you will become a much more powerful test engineer, developer, software person. Mm-hmm. So the next question is, who should be involved in creating automation strategy in the team? So that depends, is of course a horribly boring answer. But I'd say that if we assume teams are 2 pizza sized, so 10, 15 people, I'd say, or that's actually quite a big team, all the team is in the team. And just as many other things, it might be a few persons who create the strategy, but gathers the input and the knowledge from the different capabilities on the team, because it's something, automation, it matters for understanding the deployment architecture of our applications. It matters in terms of how do we test, what are our test frameworks, what are we able to automate, how do our environments look like, how do we maintain and automate our test data. So I don't think that we can say the testers should be the ones that do the automation strategy, or the developers should be the ones, because it's actually something that requires cross-functional competences. So every skill on the team should be represented in creating the test automation strategy for the team. Many places we can see much more architects and testers as some sort of quality coaches that enables teams to do better testing, better test automation, things like that. And if we are an organization of that scale, then there might also be a default template test automation strategy that we can use as our vantage point, and then customize for our team where we feel it. And involving the entire team also helps push ownership of everything to the team. And I think that's a key effort in becoming productive. So I think I will just answer the last question now. And the question is, what advice can you give from an organization who does automation work only as a side task? We're just kicking off our automation project. So I think that is a very good question. And again, it depends on what the context are and what are your challenges. One cool thing that you could do, that I really hope you want to do, and let me know how that works, is creating a value stream map of how value flows through your organization, your teams. And if at all possible, then measure times across that value stream such that you can find bottlenecks and set your automation efforts where the bottlenecks are. And also, so you have something that you can show over time. See, okay, back in January, we had a huge bottleneck here. So we might not have become much more productive overall, but the bottleneck here is not there anymore. So build a value stream map and with times and quality on top of that. And then I'd advise against solving the most difficult problem first. So if you have something that you can see, we can automate this, and this team over here, if we can just solve their problems, the rest of the teams will be easy. But that means that you solve both the challenge of learning how to work with automation, how to measure all the tools and the ways of working around that, while you're solving all the complex challenges that are over here in this team, this part of the software. So rather than that, take an easy team part of the software first and automate that, so you can both get a lot of learning without getting bogged down in the complexities of that software product. And you can get some easy wins, and those are the best ways to get allies and keep the momentum going. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, reach out to me on Twitter. There I'm Random Sort. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm Johan Abildskov. Join me in the Zoom room just after this. Thank you so much.